What's up, guys? Off a 1-3 night last night, which easily could have been 4-0. It's one of the most brutal nights that I've had. Like, I'm going to remember some of those games for probably the rest of my life. That was bad. I think I had the handicap correct on all four of those games, at least three out of the four, and all of them just wound up going down in brutal fashion. You had Niagara. That was the easiest one to take, and I was angry about that one at the time because it was the first one that finished. You look at that game, Niagara's up 15 early in the second half, and it's like, all right, sweet, that's looking pretty good. That's probably going to be a win, especially against a Marist team that's so challenged offensively that they don't really have the ability to make huge comebacks like that. And it was not a very high-scoring game, although that's more Marist style. Neither of those teams really play fast, but Marist wound up somehow erasing the entire deficit, winning that game and advancing in that MAAC. Then it just got even worse from there. I mean, around the same time, you did have the hockey game winning easily with the New Jersey Devils. So yay for me on that. The Devils, nice underdog win on that one. And then it looked like the other two were both extremely likely to cash. Both of the other basketball games had to have been somewhere in like the 90-something% range as they got down the wire to at least cover. You had the Philadelphia 76ers winning the game outright for almost the entire game. They were still winning outright in not like the highest scoring game that you'll see in the NBA, a game that was in the 80s going into the fourth quarter. They still were leading by 3 going into the fourth quarter. That feels pretty good when you have the team leading all game as an 8.5-point underdog. And I beat the closing number on that because I think it closed 7.5. And then I kind of paid attention to the end of it. And it was still, they had lost their lead, but they were still down 3 in the final couple minutes of the game. And it's like, all right, this might wind up going to like, it's getting a little bit dicey, but it might wind up just going to intentional fouls. And then usually the intentional fouls stop once you're down 7 because it's a 3-possession game. So that 7's a bit key. So usually it stops there. You don't expect it to land 9 and beat your 8.5 by a half point. That is exactly what happened after the 76ers were leading the entire game outright. And it looked like it was probably going to be an outright underdog cash on the money line. They wind up not even covering after they were covering wire to wire. You can look at like the graph that Action Network has on that game as far as covering the spread. It was like the Niagara one was pretty bad, but it was like Niagara had the majority chance to cover for the whole game. The 76ers was like, they were just way up like the whole time pretty much. It was up to the point where it was like 97% to cover or something. And then boom, right at the end, all the way down to 100% loss. Like I think they lost the cover like right at the end. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if who did I play against in that game? I don't know if there was like some running up of the score involved. There was that against Milwaukee. I think it was. I don't even remember. There might have been some running up of the score. I don't know. I don't know how Milwaukee got those final points, but that loses by a half point. And then it just gets even worse from there. Because then it looked like Villanova was probably going to be able to cover because Villanova, it seemed like that handicap was right as well. The 76ers handicap was right. The Villanova handicap was right. And you don't get either of them right. It's just ridiculous. And the way the Villanova one ended, come on, man. The game played to Villanova's pace. It was a very low-scoring game. It was like in the 50s as it got down towards the end of regulation. So obviously the game's being played at Villanova's pace. Villanova was covering the majority of that game. They were hanging within the 4.5 because it was a low-scoring game, played the style game they wanted, good defensive game, stayed in the game the whole time. I think they had leads at various points in the game. Looked like they definitely had a chance to win outright. Then it got down to the point where it was a tied game and Marquette had the final possession with 2 or 3 seconds left or whatever. And at that point, you're just thinking, just score here and just win on the cover and just lose the money line, but win the majority of the bet there, the 90% of the bet, and just come away with a spread cover here, please, because you do not want that thing to go into overtime. Even though Villanova's playing slow, they're playing at their pace. Even if it goes into overtime, they're still probably more likely than not going to cover, but let's not even take that chance. At that point, you're just rooting for Marquette to just score a bucket at the end, win and not cover, just get out of there with the plus 4.5, the win on the spread bet at least. Marquette hit what looked like a buzzer beater. You guys might have been watching, and I don't know. It was probably the closest call that I've ever seen. It was like I don't remember which player on Marquette it was, but it was like the ball left his fingertips at the exact same time that the clock ran out. I don't know how you can determine whether it was good or not, and they ruled that it was good on the court, but with that video evidence, it was so close. You really did not expect them to overturn that. And they did. They overturned it. Bucket waved off. They said that the ball was still like grazing his fingertips, I guess, as time expired, which very, very difficult to determine that. It seemed like the call that was made on the floor would have had to stand given that video evidence, but that was not the case. I guess the refs slowed it down enough to the point where they could actually see that like split second where maybe it was still touching his fingers. I don't know. It was the closest thing I've ever seen, though. So now it goes into overtime, and I'm just like, I know I'm going to lose this bet now. It's the most brutal thing ever to lose on a call like that. An overturned call where the game was over with a Villanova 2-point loss, even though I'd kind of like to see Villanova win and continue, especially because I kind of want to see them get into the tournament. I think they're actually good enough to get in. I think they deserve it, like metrics-wise. But no, that wasn't the case. And then they were still covering throughout the entirety of overtime because overtime wasn't high-scoring either, really. But Villanova really couldn't score much in overtime. I think they probably only scored 2 points in overtime, and they wound up losing. At the only point that they were not covering in overtime was on the final foul that they committed. They committed an intentional foul at the end and wound up losing by 6. And I think they had one more final possession with 4 seconds left at the end and could have potentially scored on that one to cut it back to within the number. But no, they lose by 6. So between that one and the Philadelphia 76ers one, 2 bets go down by a combined 2 points, a half point and then 1.5 on the other one. Both are losses that looked like they were probably somewhere upwards of like 97% to cover by the time the game got down to the end there, down to the wire. It's just completely insane how you can lose bets like that. I don't know how it happens. I think I was right about both of them. You just got to get yourself together, just move on, just continue to do what you're doing. When you look at those games and you know that you handicap those games right, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to remember that Villanova one forever. Like, that's one of the worst beats that you could have. When it looks, the box on the TV even shows that the final score was them losing by 2 and you getting the cover, and then they wave off the bucket. All right, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in college basketball here. There were no more auto bid clinchers yesterday, although I forgot to mention the 3 that happened the day before that, which were Colgate. But I mean, everybody kind of figured Colgate was going to win their conference. They have won the Patriot League yet again. Congratulations to Colgate. I think I probably have them on like the 15 line in the tournament, somewhere around there again, because I think that's where they were last year. They're in a 3rd straight tournament, 3rd straight Patriot League win, I suppose. Then what was the other? There were 2. McNeese, of course, dominated the Southland Conference. They did not really have much difficulty winning their conference final there against Nichols, I believe. Colgate beat Lehigh in their final. So McNeese continues their dominance of the Southland, winning that tournament quite easily. They've had a really good season. They got Will Wade as their coach, who was, I believe, at LSU before this, and he took that LSU team to at least one tournament, although they had an early exit. But McNeese is probably going to be like a 12 seed in the tournament, and they're probably going to be a lot of bracket pickers picking them as an upset pick in the first round because they're like, whatever they are, 31-3 is their record on the season or something, but they play such lower competition that I don't know, man. Like, I know I won a bet on them during the earlier part of the season when they went into Michigan and beat Michigan outright as like 10.5-point underdogs. But if you were to line that game today, there's no way Michigan would be favored by that much because everybody knows how bad they are now. But that was back then where we didn't really know yet. But McNeese will probably be a popular upset pick. I don't know if I'm going to wind up doing so in my bracket. It depends on how the whole thing shapes up. And then Montana State won the Big Sky as the 5 seed. In that tournament, every result in that tournament was an upset except for I believe the semifinal matchups that Montana State and Montana played. They were favored in those matchups, and they wound up winning those games as favorites. Every other game, including the final, was an upset. And I had that game on, the Big Sky final, and Montana, that was one of the most ridiculous implosions I've ever seen. Montana probably was the third best team in that conference, like Ken Palm wise, behind Eastern Washington and Weber State. I believe Montana was probably third, and I think they were also the 3 seed in the tournament. Montana State was a 5. Montana State has, of course, won that conference now 3 years in a row, but they've had a lot of turnover this year. The team that they had the last 2 years, where they had, I forget the guy's name, the big guy with the goggles, really good player that Montana State had. That team, they've had a lot of turnover since then. Like, they lost a couple of those best players they had those 2 prior years that they made the tournament, so it was not expected that basically a rebuilding Montana State team was going to get the auto bid again to the tournament, but that is exactly what happened. And Montana had beaten them twice during the regular season this year too, although they shot out of their minds, I think, in both of those regular season games. Montana had, I believe, an 11-point lead with 11 minutes left in that game or something like that. And then they hit a point where they didn't score at all for 6 minutes or more than a 6-minute span. And there was like an 8-minute span where they only had 2 points, and it was on a goaltender. So they hadn't put the ball in the basket for like an 8-minute period in one of the most crucial parts of the game. And it swung from an 11-point Montana lead all the way over to like a 16-point Montana State lead. And I think Montana State wound up pushing it almost to 20 by the end of it. So it was like a 30-point swing basically in like a 10-minute period. It was totally insane. And congratulations to these teams, to Colgate, McNeese, and Montana State. Montana State wound up doing it again, getting out of there with a win, a 3rd straight Big Sky title. They were below 500 going into that tournament, and now they're only at 500. I would expect Montana State to be all the way down on the 16 line probably, and maybe even potentially wind up in the first 4 because they are really not that good. So I don't know. We'll see where they wind up getting seeded. I have them as one of the 16s that's not in a first 4 game in my bracketology right now, but very likely to be on the 16 line. We move on to today. Of course, the conference tournaments are still in play. There are a lot of games going on here. I don't like much of what I see really on the slate, like betting wise. You do have situations where you have teams that have a game under their belt and are motivated, and they're playing against a team that has not played a game yet in the tournament. That would apply to Ohio State. So I would lean to Ohio State. And that's the other thing. The big bubble games last night, yesterday I was right about all of them, and I didn't bet any of them. I was right about Ohio State. I was right about New Mexico. I was right about Pittsburgh. I was right about, what was the other one? St. John's. Correct about every single one of them and didn't bet any of them. So that feels great as well. I mean, at least it makes you feel like you're thinking about these games is still right. Ohio State's a 4.5-point underdog today against Illinois, which does look like it's kind of too tempting to take Illinois there, but Illinois has not played in the tournament yet. They're a very offensive team coming in cold. So I do kind of lean to Ohio State there, and Ohio State getting points and really needing the game to continue to advance here, because they're not going to make the tournament unless they do win that game. So I do like Ohio State to cover in that one. And I kind of like Florida as well, because they have a game under their belt playing Alabama, whereas Alabama does not. Florida is sitting as an unranked team, although Alabama, I think, is underranked at 19. But Florida, I think, is being shortchanged as well, not being ranked at all. But that's going to be an interesting one, too, I would say, because Florida does have a game under their belt, and they suffered kind of a scare last night against Georgia, where Georgia was leading them for almost the entire first half, and the game was still very close. In the final couple of minutes, it was down to like a 1-point game again or something like that. So Florida was able to get out of there with an escape, and now you have an Alabama team that really relies on offense coming in, not having played yet in this tournament. Florida having that one game under their belt and it being a scare, I think, is more helpful to Florida. So I do like Florida to cover that game against Alabama. One hesitation there would be that the line is moving up from Alabama 3.5 to 4 or whatever, but also, or 3 to 4, but also that, so it looks like there was some money on them, but also that Florida did just house Alabama the last time they played them a couple weeks before the season ended. Florida got revenge on them because Florida had gone into Alabama and lost, and only lost by 5. But that does mean that Florida seems to match up pretty well against Alabama. Both teams are fast and kind of defensively challenged and can score a ton. So that's going to be a pretty crazy game. It'll probably be a very entertaining game, at least Florida and Alabama tonight. That game is a night game at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. But yeah, we'll see what happens in that one. But Florida did beat Alabama by almost 20 at Florida in the most recent matchup. So Florida seems like they've had a decent matchup against Alabama. They've been a decent matchup against Alabama there. So I don't know, but I like the fact that Florida's already played a game in the tournament and Alabama has not. But the game that I'm actually going to go to is going to be to play on Virginia. This is going to be my only college basketball play as it stands right now. Virginia looks like they're going up from what opened a 2-point favorite. They're up to 2.5. Not much of a difference to do 2 and 2.5, really. I mean, you're laying a bucket or a little bit above a bucket, but I mean, it's not that much different, even though with Virginia, of course, they play the slowest tempo in all of college basketball. 362 out of 362 on KenPom, and they're just a hideous offense. So points are hard to come by in a Virginia game. So laying points, maybe a little bit questionable, but I like the spot for Virginia here. Virginia, they've only played one game in this tournament so far, and it was last night against Boston College. And the one thing that gives me a little bit of hesitation is that was a later game than the game that the team played that I'm going up against, but both games were night games, so there isn't really that much of a difference there. Virginia, of course, was the favorite in that game, and BC was beating Virginia for almost the entire game. BC led almost the whole way, wound up going into overtime, and Virginia was able to beat them in overtime and play a much better overtime period. So Virginia, as a favorite there, even though they're only about a 6-point favorite or whatever, I still consider that to be suffering kind of a scare there. So Virginia, I think that's going to cause them to focus here. And they have that game under their belt now. That was the only game they played in the tournament so far. And who are they up against? NC State, who played like right before they did last night. But NC State has now played 3 games in 3 days in the tournament. They beat Louisville in the opening round a couple days ago. Then they beat Syracuse pretty easily, a Syracuse team that maybe was fighting to try to get onto the bubble a little bit. And then last night, NC State beat their big rival in Duke in a close game and just hung on right at the end for the win there. And it looked like the refs are kind of really helping Duke out at the end. There were just so many calls and plays that went Duke's way that were just kind of crazy there, and just kind of stupidity on NC State's part as well. But NC State was still able to get out of there with a win. That's a monster win. And I don't think that there are really letdowns in tournaments like this, but if you're NC State, how much could you have left in the tank at all? You're facing a Virginia team that's only played one game in this tournament so far. So Virginia's got to be the much more rested team here, even though they played the slightly later game last night. They suffered a scare in that game, which I think is going to cause them to be focused on this game. And on top of that, Virginia, they are like a bubble team. They're on the bubble to make the tournament here, so they really can't afford to lose this game either. You might say that's going to put pressure on them, but it also means they're going to be motivated, and really you're just kind of picking them to win the game here. So I think that's fine as well. I think that's just extra motivation there. They've only played one game in the last few days, whereas NC State is now playing their 4th game in 4 days. That's got to take its toll, especially on an NC State team like this that, I mean, how good is NC State really? I don't know, but it's got to take its toll, man, especially when they just beat one of their biggest rivals last night. I don't even see where NC State is here. Where does he have NC State? KenPom has them 67th, so he actually has Virginia. He has Virginia a little bit better, so he has them probably right around like a 1 or 2 point favorite. Laying 2.5, I don't know, but NC State does play significantly faster than Virginia, as everybody does. Virginia, of course, is the much better defense, but the worse offense. Virginia offensively challenged, but they play much, much better defense. The 6th ranked defense in the country, although they are 9th in lock in KenPom. Virginia's just a team of extremes. They have a bad offense. They have one of the best defenses in the country, the slowest team in the country, and one of the luckiest teams in the country. But they could slow NC State down. NC State does want to play at a significantly faster pace than Virginia does. So that could frustrate NC State. And it's an NC State team having to play, like I said, a 4th game in 4 days, whereas Virginia's only playing a 2nd game in that same span. So I think NC State, you got to think at some point they're going to run out of gas a little bit here. And NC State, I think they know they're not going to make the tournament. They're not going to make the NCAA tournament, even though, of course, they will if they actually win the ACC tournament. But they would have to win this game against Virginia, and they would have to beat North Carolina, presuming that North Carolina wins their matchup against whoever they're playing today, Pittsburgh, which North Carolina is probably a double-digit favorite in that one, although Pittsburgh is playing for their tournament lives. But we'll see if Pittsburgh can actually do something in that game. But still, NC State, I think they pretty much still know they're not making the tournament. So I think they might consider that win over Duke there to be like, that was like their big game of the season, man. They were able to get back at Duke. NC State played Duke pretty tough at NC State towards the end of the season there in a game that I lost on NC State there. NC State just kind of fell apart in the second half in that one. And I don't think the final score was indicative of how close that game actually was. NC State was able to do it last night, and maybe they finally like shot their wad in a big win in the ACC tournament over Duke. Huge win as like a double-digit underdog. I don't know what they're going to have left. And that being their third game in the last 3 days. So NC State might run out of steam. So I'm going to be on Virginia. I'm skipping the NHL card, by the way. There are only 2 games tonight with big favorites in both of them. I just don't want to get involved in that. Going over to basketball, I will say that I do lean to the Pelicans against the Clippers, but I really don't want to lay 7 with the Pelicans. Pelicans are up from 6, now going through the 7 with juice, it looks like, with 63% of the cash and 55% of the tickets on the Pelicans. So it looks like they do have the money coming in on the Pelicans, moving the line up. The Clippers, the reason why the Pelicans are such a big favorite in this game is because the James Harden's status is questionable, but he didn't play last night. And if he plays tonight, then that line will obviously have to come down a little bit on the Pelicans. So if you like the Pelicans side, I don't know what you want to do here, because you got to really like watch the Harden injury situation, because if he's not going to play, I think the line can only go, if he's not going to play, the line might even like go up a little bit further on the Pelicans. So you might not even get 7 as the best number there. But if he is going to play, then the line might drop back down a little bit towards like the 6 range. I don't know. So it's tough to gauge. It all kind of depends on Harden. Too many moving parts, really. I don't know if I want to get involved in that. But the Clippers are on a back-to-back, and they played last night. So that's the reason I do not like the Clippers. But I think some of that's being factored into the line with the Pelicans being such a heavy favorite. Clippers played a good game last night. They're playing a third game in 4 days now, all in different cities. A fourth game in 6 days, although the first 2 are at home. But those are against Milwaukee, Minnesota, both big games that they lost by 7 and 8 points, tough games. Then last night, they played pretty well at Chicago to start this 2-game road trip and beat Chicago pretty easily. Now with no time off, they have to go to this New Orleans team who's a pretty good team, and New Orleans is probably going to be in an angry mood coming off a really embarrassing performance against Cleveland, but that was in a return home spot for New Orleans, so that was a bad spot, returning home from a 3-game road trip, and Cleveland just totally embarrassed them on their own floor by 21 points. So I think New Orleans, maybe they're in the return home and they're maybe looking ahead to this game. I don't know. Maybe they just overlooked Cleveland a little bit without Donovan Mitchell, whatever the case may be. It was a distracted return home spot, even though they had an extra day off before playing that game. Not a good spot for New Orleans, still not a good game at all. So I think New Orleans is in much more of a bounce back spot here. I like the situation for New Orleans. The problem is just the number. I don't know if I really want to lay 7, and we got to see what happens with the Harden injury. Kawhi Leonard and Paul George have both been in and out of the lineup as well, and they both played last night. And it's also, I think, unclear if LA is going to be resting anybody in this game, because it is a back-to-back, and they just took the first game of the back-to-back last night. So does that mean LA is not going to pay as much attention in this game, even though New Orleans is a much better team? Do you think LA just kind of focused on getting the easier of the 2 wins and maybe thinking that they weren't going to win this New Orleans game anyway, so get the like sure win against Chicago basically, and then maybe rest some guys against New Orleans? Is that what they're going to do? I don't know. Too many moving parts for me to really want to get involved in this one, but what I will do is play against the Phoenix Suns, where you can actually get the Hornets plus 10 right now. It's up from 9.5 to 10. Suns 85% of the tickets and only 81% of the cash. So of course they're massively public. The Suns public and laying probably way too many points on the road, I would say. This is a sandwich spot that the Suns are in. Even though they lost last night, they're on a back-to-back, but they did have 2 days off before that, but it's still a back-to-back. It's a 3rd straight road game since the 11th. They won at Cleveland, and in their last series of games there, they played Boston, Cleveland, and then Boston again. So they lost by 10 at home to Boston. Then they started the road trip, won at Cleveland, even though they were in a Celtics sandwich. Then they went into Boston last night and hung in the game, I guess I would say, even though the Celtics pretty much had the game in hand for almost the entire second half. But Phoenix put in an effort there. They didn't go away. And that's, of course, a game that you get emotionally up for. It's a game that you definitely try to win. And now Phoenix is coming off that, no time off, and they have to go to this lowly Charlotte Hornets team. And then coming up on Sunday ABC game. They get the Milwaukee Bucks, and then they get the Philadelphia 76ers when they come back home. So if they're going to overlook a game, you got to think it's going to be this one, even though, yeah, they are 1-1 on the road trip right now. They do want to get up to 2-1, but I don't know what they're going to have left right now. Like, they're on a back-to-back, so they might not be they're not in the best rest spot at all, of course. And will they overlook Charlotte a little bit? I think maybe they will, because it's just sandwiched in there between games against much better teams, bigger teams, a couple of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. So it's possible that Phoenix kind of overlooks Charlotte a little bit. Charlotte has been playing well. They came out of the All-Star break, or I think they went into the All-Star break and came out of the All-Star break playing pretty decent basketball, but then have kind of suffered some losses more recently, and some of them to not very good teams either, getting blown out by the Pistons 2 games ago. But then they were able to turn it around and smack the Grizzlies in a second road game on that 2-game road trip that they had there, where they just went to Detroit and Memphis. But they have 1 day off, and they are returning home from a road trip, but it's only a 2-game road trip. And going back to Charlotte from Memphis, really, who cares? It's not a huge trip at all, and they have the day off, whereas Phoenix does not. I think Charlotte's going to be focused here, and I think that the fact they've won 2 of their last 3 games, and in their last game they were able to beat Memphis, and these games were against teams that aren't very good, in Brooklyn and Memphis, I think that's just going to give them a little bit of confidence, give them a little bit of winning momentum, and some confidence coming into this game, which I think they'll be focused on, because it's the Phoenix Suns. Kevin Durant, Devin Booker coming into their house, so I do think Charlotte's going to be focused. And Phoenix, really, I keep saying they do have kind of a thin bench, even though they have a couple of stars on their team. Kevin Durant is also kind of old. Like, Phoenix does have a couple of guys that are kind of on the older side as well. And then, like, their bench, I find to be a little bit short. So Phoenix being in a bad rest spot, I think, can kind of compound that as well, especially given the fact they're playing a team that they might not really have full focus on. Whereas Charlotte, I like this as more of a momentum spot here, because even though it is a return home, it's from a very short trip where they won the last game, which I think is going to just give them some momentum a little bit, beating the Grizzlies, who are one of the worst teams in basketball with their current personnel situation. But I still think that's just kind of a confidence boost there for Charlotte. So those are the only 2 plays today, man. After last night, where I think I handicapped all those games correctly, and it's just brutal what happened last night. We got to get back on track here. So today, the only plays are Charlotte Hornets +10 and Virginia -2.5. That's going to do it for me, man. I am Toad. Let's get into this final college basketball conference tournament weekend on the right foot. And I will mention really quickly that there is going to be a bid steal in the tournament out of the Atlantic 10 as well, which is interesting, because all the top seeds got knocked out yesterday, including Dayton. I believe Dayton is certainly going to still be in the tournament as an at-large. They're the only A10 team that's going to get an at-large. So that means that whoever wins the A10, which is looking like it's probably going to be VCU again right now, obviously one of those teams is going to get an auto bid, and that's going to steal a bid. So it's going to knock some team off the bubble again. And right now I have that team getting knocked off the bubble knocked out of the final slot in the first 4 games. I have that team being Providence, very unfortunately, because Providence had a big win over Creighton last night. But I think that even that, I think, might not quite be enough given the bubble situation here, which is very unfortunate. Providence, and they are up against Marquette today, which, if Marquette's still going to be without Cole, like, that is kind of still a winnable game for a pretty competitive Providence team. Providence doing this without Bryce Hopkins, very impressive. But Providence, they might very unfortunately, even despite that big win last night, they might still wind up being that first team that winds up getting left out of the tournament, which would be very, very unfortunate. But because of the Atlantic 10 bid steal situation, that might wind up being the case, which is insane. And of course, the bid steals are not done either. We might have other ones before this is all said and done. So peace out, man.